the law, because once it's in law, it's set in stone. And so that's where we pick up in chapter 4. Let me see if I can. Actually, give me 1 second while I access my notes, assuming my fingers can move in the right pattern to get this password. And yes, there we go. All right. The title of today's sermon is The Dreaded Solution. This is another one of those things that would totally fit a, what am I thinking, an eerie minor key of an organ or something to fit kind of the setting. So, end of the last chapter, the Jews are going to die. This chapter, chapter 4, talks about the solution that Mordecai comes up with for the problem. So, point number 1 of the exposition is the weeping Jew. This is going to cover verses 1 through 4, so we're going to pick it up with verse 1. When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went into the midst of the city, and cried with a loud and bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. And verse 4, so Esther's maids and her chamberlains came and told it her. Then she sent raiment to... Okay, I missed the line. Then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai, and to take away his sackcloth from him, but he received it not. So, to summarize those 4 verses, Mordecai puts on sackcloth and ashes. That was a custom back in the day during, I believe, well, based on other accounts, it might have not just been a Jewish thing, but might have been a cultural thing throughout that entire section of the world, that when you're going through some season of sorrow or grief, that to display it to other people, you would put on a sackcloth and then sprinkle ashes on your head. And that was kind of to show everybody that you're going through something difficult, so that they could acknowledge that fact and then provide you with comfort, possibly. As we see, it was not only used by the Jews and Israel, because the Ninevites also used it, whom Jonah went to and preached in the book of Jonah. When they repented, it says that they repented in sackcloth and ashes. So they put on the sackcloth and the ashes as well. So it wasn't just a Jewish thing. On top of that, something that's kind of interesting side note is that in the city of Nineveh, when the city repented, the king of that city said, not only are the men, the women, and the children going to wear sackcloth and ashes, we're going to put them on even the animals. So, all the cattle, all the livestock, all the donkeys, all the horses, all the camels and whatnot, they threw a sackcloth over them and put ashes on them as well. Which is kind of a interesting thing. It's like likely thinking, well, it can't hurt, and on top of that, like, better be safe than sorry with God. So, which God, of course, spared the city, not because they went to that length per se, but because they truly repented. But that's just a little interesting side note. So when sackcloth and ashes come around in different passages of Scripture, it's associating the person with a season of sorrow and grief, or that some occasion that brings about those has come about. So that's the situation that Mordecai's in. And it says in verse 3, or verse 2, that nobody can go into the king's palace or into the king's court wearing sackcloth and ashes. Probably because it's, well, it's like showing up at a wedding in street clothes. It's like not acceptable. You're going to get not only a bunch of weird looks, but in this case, you could probably just get thrown out because somebody says, hey, the king says people aren't allowed in here looking like that. So he's not allowed into the king's palace, so he sits outside the gate and cries, wearing sackcloth and ashes. On top of that, all the Jews throughout the entire palace city do the same thing. And so word reaches Esther via her maids and her chamberlain, and she doesn't know what in the world's going on. She just knows, well, from the looks of it and from the other verses, it seems like she never got word of the decree that went out. So she's totally in the dark on this, and she just hears that Mordecai's distressed and wearing sackcloth and ashes, which instantly means that he's mourning about something. And it says that she tries sending him new clothes. I was kind of thinking today when I was reading that, that's like, that's cute. His cousin, like, she notices that he's feeling down, so she tries sending him new clothes because that makes her happy, likely, because she's a lady. But I don't know. Regardless, she sends him some new clothes. However, he doesn't wear them. That's when she knows something's up. Which is kind of reading a little bit of humor into the story. But she did send him the garments, and he didn't wear them. So she sends and asks what is going on. Point number 2, Mordecai's faith. And I'm kind of joining the 2 points, or 2 would-be points, to try to shorten this. So point number 2 is Mordecai's faith, and that's going to cover verses 5 through verse 14. Starting with verse 5. Then called Esther for Hathach, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and gave him commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. So basically, go ask Mordecai, what are you doing this and why are you doing this? Or what is this for and why are you doing this? Verse 6, so Hathach went forth to Mordecai unto the street of the city, which was before the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries for the Jews to destroy them. Also he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and declared unto her, and to charge her that she should go in unto the king, to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. That was kind of a lot going on in those couple of verses. So she sends a guy, ask Mordecai what's going on. When he gets to Mordecai, Mordecai tells him what's going on. Not only that, as extra proof, if Esther needed it, he sent a copy of the decree so that she could look over it for herself and see the huge amount of money that Haman has agreed to pay people throughout the kingdom for the destruction of all the Jews and all that. And Mordecai's solution, he says, is for Esther to go to the king to talk to the king about it. Because up to this point, Esther has not told the king that she's Jewish. In fact, probably nobody throughout the entire palace knows that she's Jewish. Possibly not even her own maids and her chamberlain. They might not even know that she's Jewish as well. And so, that's Mordecai's solution for the problem. Haman concocted this big evil scheme for how to eliminate all the Jews based solely on the fact that one guy did not bow down to him. And so because of that, he wants to kill off all the people of that man's former nation. And so now Mordecai comes up with a plan to attempt to revert that or undo what is going to happen. And to, by means of Esther being the queen of Persia, have her see if she can do something about it. And let's see, verse 9. And Hathach came and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Again Esther spake unto Hathach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. So this is what she says. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his, to put him to death, except such to whom the king may hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. So this is a little problem in Mordecai's plan that he has is that apparently at one point or another, it might have been under King Ahasuerus' reign, might have been under another king's reign. However, it wasn't stated into law now that whosoever walks into the king's presence without being summoned, if the king doesn't want to talk to him at that moment, that guy dies. Starting to think that a lot of these laws quite possibly were all when the king was merry with wine. Because a lot of these don't seem like something that a person in their right mind would make. Either that or it might have been another king as well. But that's the result of it. If the king doesn't want to talk to you and you come into his presence, you're dead. And that's the law. And she says that she hasn't been summoned by the king, or she hasn't seen the king in a month, practically. Because the king hasn't requested that she come before him over the course of that entire month. So, that's a little problem in Mordecai's plan that he has. And we see where Mordecai's faith comes in, which is found in verses 12 and 13 and 14. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. So he's kind of telling her in that verse, don't think that just because you're in the king's house that you're going to be exempt from this. And that people aren't going to attempt to kill you just because you're the queen. I mean, there was obviously guys that tried to overthrow the throne and tried to kill the king just, 2 chapters earlier. So, obviously, there would be likely a number of people who would be more than happy to have an excuse to kill the queen after they find out that she's Jewish as well. So he says, don't think that you're going to get by if you're quiet about it and that you're going to outlast us all. And he says in verse 14, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So for all those who wonder and who sit in on Pastor Miller's lessons, this is where the phrase that Pastor Miller uses so often comes from, for such a time as this. This is the verse. And it's Mordecai kind of reminding Esther that she was just chosen to be the queen, kind of what would seem randomly to a person who does not believe in God, was actually providentially through the perspective of someone who does believe in God. That it wasn't a coincidence that she became the queen, and she happened to be Jewish as well at the time that this law came out stating that they were going to kill off all the Jews. And so he basically says, which, as I've said before, this is one book in the Bible that nowhere in the entire book of Esther will you find the name of God in any way, shape, or form. Throughout the entire book, the name of God is not listed anywhere. However, this is a great verse that kind of speaks very much to God's presence in this matter without directly saying his name. By saying, basically it's implied that Mordecai is telling her, who knows whether or not God put you into this position specifically for the reason that he knew Haman was going to come up with this plan. And something else that I noticed when I was reading this, which is interesting as well, is that in verse 14 it says, for if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then listen to this, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. For some reason, I guess I had never read over that, or I've forgotten it, if I have read over it. But what Mordecai is basically saying here is that he has faith in God's promise that the exile that they're in is going to end and they're going to go back to Israel. And that this isn't going to be the extermination of the Jews, because God said beforehand that he was going to bring them back out of their exile, even though it clearly says in the decree that all the Jews are going to die. He says that God prophesied in the past that the Jews are not going to be extinct. And so he has faith at this point that not only is this plan not going to completely kill off all the Jews, but that the Jews are going to be delivered from that and are going to go back to Israel, based on God's earlier promises in other books of Scripture. However, he says that while the Jews aren't going to be completely obliterated by this, he says it's more than likely that you and all of our family is going to be destroyed. Just because the Jews, as a nation, aren't going to be destroyed doesn't mean that some of the Jews aren't going to die in this process if you do nothing about it. But he has faith that all the Jews are not going to die because God said that they were going to return to Israel. So, now go on to the last point, which is point number 3, Esther's decision. This is where we see the reply that she has. Verse 15. Then Esther bade them return to Mordecai this answer. Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according unto the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way, and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. So, to kind of summarize the entire chapter real quickly, Mordecai gets distressed, gets grieved, puts on sackcloth and ashes, as well as everyone else throughout the entire kingdom likely, and around the palace. Esther gets word of it. She asks him what's going on. He says, sends her a copy of the decree stating that the Jews are going to be destroyed on a certain day, and says that she needs to go to the king to talk to him to try to change the king's mind or see if the king can do something about that. She says that if the king doesn't want me there, I could lose my head for this. He says, basically in short, that with this decree, you're going to be dead anyways if you don't do anything. But he also says that in the midst of this, we have an opportunity because all of these circumstances seem to have fit together as if God were putting all the pieces together by himself and already knew all of this was going to happen, which is why he put you in the position of being the king's wife. So when she gets that answer, she says, pray and fast with me for 3 days, and after that I'm going to break the law and go in before the king. And she says at the end of verse 16, and if I perish, I perish. Basically saying, if I'm going to die, then I'm going to die. So be it. It's one of those, maybe not exactly mic drop moments, but would be something like thinking of Jumanji right now with The Rock, the smoldering intensity. Just has the moment of, wow, that is such a strong character to be able to state something like that and actually have the guts to back it up, which Esther totally did, as we can see in the next chapter. She does exactly that, stating that if my people are going to die, I'm going to risk myself to go and save them. If the king doesn't want me there and I get killed, oh well, I tried. But she's going to do it. So, it says in verse 17, that Mordecai went his way and did all according to what Esther commanded him, stating that he went, gathered all the Jews throughout that entire palace, and they all fasted and prayed, didn't eat anything, didn't drink anything for 3 days while they prayed. So a quick little thing, is fasting for today? Yes or no? How many yes? I shouldn't have put my hand up. Okay. So, there is actually verses in the New Testament that address fasting. Jesus himself said in the New Testament, when you fast, along the same chapter, I believe it's Matthew chapter 6, when he talked about this, he says that when he's talking about giving your tithes and when you pray, and he includes when you fast, when he's talking about how the Pharisees like to make a big show out of things. And when they pray, they like to go out in public places where everybody can see them and pray very loud and lengthy prayers so that everyone can pay attention to them and recognize how holy and spiritual they are. Same with their tithes. He says that the Pharisees, when they give their tithes, it says, I believe that Jesus even said they sound a trumpet in front of them to get everyone to look their way while they drop their money in the plate, per se. And then when he talks about fasting, he says that they disfigure themselves, saying that they dirty themselves up and likely use makeup and whatnot to give them the appearance that they are about to die if they don't have something to eat, so that people can recognize how spiritual they are by how long they fasted when they might have not even been fasting that long. Because with the Pharisees, it was all a show. But Jesus did not condemn fasting in the same way he didn't condemn giving tithe or prayer. He says, when you're doing those things, don't make it obvious that you're doing it. He says that when you fast, he says, wash your face, change your clothes and whatnot to make it look like you're fine and that nothing's happening. Because he says the purpose of a fast is not to get everyone else's attention. It's supposed to get God's attention. And it says the Father who sees in secret will reward you openly, saying that God knows the stuff that you do to not get attention for it. And God will reward you for the times that you try not to seek attention for doing what God wants you to do. So fasting is for today. However, it does not mean that we should be fasting 24/7, because if that was the case, we'd all be dead. Because you need food, and you need water, and you need, well, Mountain Dew, of course. How many like Mountain Dew? All right. Taco Bell, Baja Blast. It's the best flavor ever. So, getting back to the lesson side of this, that sums it up for chapter 4. Now we're going to very quickly be covering. Wow, we're doing really good on time. Maybe I should just make all of these 6 points. So, now for the 3 points on the topical segment of this lesson, which is entitled Takeaway Today, which correlate to the 3 points of the exposition. The first point of the exposition was the weeping Jew, so the first point of the takeaway is a Christian's grief. Can Christians be sad? Yes. Is it a sin to be sad? No, it is absolutely not. How do we know that for a fact? Because Jesus was sad. Enough said. There you go. If Jesus was sad and Jesus never sinned and could pay for the sin of the world, obviously being sad is not a sin. So, there is a passage which is found in 1 Samuel chapter 12. This, I believe I've told the story enough times so that you don't need to turn back to it. However, those were kind of a while back. However, I do bring up this lesson a whole lot, or this account of King David, just because I love this story. Right after he finishes killing Uriah in order to get Uriah's wife Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan gets sent by God to go and confront to confront David about his sin. And Nathan does so in the form of a story, because who doesn't like stories? On top of that, he makes it very allegorical, to the point where David does not know that he's referring to him as the character in the story, so that David has a more open mind as to how he would judge the matter in the story, which is actually, I think, a great way to bring different ideas to different people. If someone, per se, like, I'll take me for example. There's some friends of mine on social media that a while back they had a bit of a falling out. So, I was trying to think of how I could find a way to get them back together. The problem was that, how many of y'all use Discord? I should say, rather, how many of y'all know what Discord is? It's a social media app. It's all right. So it's kind of like a group text, only on the internet, mostly used by gamers, but other people with different similar interests kind of meet and talk about different, what am I thinking, different interests that they share and whatnot. So it's a really interesting place to meet other people. However, in each of the servers that different people start up, they can establish rules. And they can also establish other people to help them in the maintaining of those rules and to enforce those rules. That if you do this, then we can kick you out of this server that we've started. Which happens every now and then on a server that I'm a part of. But there was kind of a falling out between some of the people, which not a lot of detail is known about it. However, it seemed like it just happened one evening and suddenly these people weren't friends anymore. And then there was a rule, basically the next day or very soon after that, which said, anyone who brings up this person who we just kicked off the server in the middle of all of this, you risk getting kicked off yourself. We don't want to hear anything about this guy anymore. So, I wanted to try to find a way to get those people to talk again. Because it seemed like just over the course of one night, their friendship that they'd been building up over the course of 1 year was destroyed because of one foolish mistake that one of the guys made. Which I thought was a little bit going too far to try to like never have anything to do with this person ever again. However, under certain circumstances, it might be valid depending on what happened. I don't completely know entirely what happened, but I was trying to think of a way, how can I get them to talk to each other, because I can't even bring it up without the risk of them never talking to me again as well. And then an idea came to me, which is using the exact same thing that Nathan did, which is making up an allegory and a story about an incident that has just happened, and then show it to the people so that in the allegorical sense, they don't affiliate it with something else that happened. And because of that, they'll have a more open mind about what takes place in the allegory. So that afterwards, even as Nathan did, because Nathan put his life on the line by confronting the king about something that the king did. Because at any moment, when the prophet Nathan said, "You're guilty of sin," King David could have said, "And you're a dead man," and had him sent off to the block. Off goes his head. However, Nathan, under the inspiration of God, brought up this allegory in which he could confront it in a manner which made David more open-minded about the topic. And I believe that I have just dived down a massive rabbit hole that does not have anything to pertain to the actual topic which I was leading up towards. So that's just an interesting story. Read 1 Samuel chapter 11 and 12. It's a really interesting story if you haven't already. So 1 Samuel chapter 12, talking about Christian grief. That's what we were talking about, right? Not about confronting sin. Which, if you're confronting sin, of course, that is probably going to lead to grief. As it did with David's case, which is what I was eventually going to lead back around to. So, David gets confronted about his sin. And David's response is that he repents. And he says, "I've sinned before God." Not only that, but the consequences because of his sin should have been by the Jewish law that he should have paid the death penalty twice. One for adultery of the wife of Uriah, and the second for the murder of Uriah himself. Both of those were recompensed under the Jewish law by death. However, the prophet Nathan says, God has spared you and he's not going to let you die. However, there were consequences because of his actions. The consequence being the death of the baby that Bathsheba was pregnant with. During that time, happened over the course of 1 week. After the baby was born, the baby got very, very sick, and the baby died. Over the course of that entire week, David fasted. Possibly for the entire week, or as soon as he found out about that, because Nathan told him right then what the consequence was going to be. He said, Nathan told David that God decided that you're not going to die for this. However, the consequence for this action is going to be that the child that you got Bathsheba pregnant with is going to die. And at that moment, David knew that the child was going to die because that was God's decree. And for the entire week, David fasted, David prayed, David, I believe, put sackcloth and ashes on, didn't bathe himself, didn't do anything like that, was basically crying and going through insane grief for the entire week. And over the course of 1 week, the child got sick after it was born, and by the end of the week, the child died. At that point, however, and this is what contrasts Christians' grief with grief of non-believers, is that after David found out that the child was dead, he got up, washed himself off, ate some food, got something to drink, and just went back to normal, as if nothing had happened. And when his servants asked him about this, which is what separates Christian grief from the world, because when the world goes through something like this, like something else for the people that are watching, or for the people here who don't necessarily believe that all this is providence or that all this is fair, none of it makes sense to us. Like why David's child would have to pay for the sins of David himself. Like, that doesn't seem fair. And a lot of people would go about saying that God is therefore unjust because of that. And then with all the other instances throughout all of history of events that happen all the time, like people passing away of COVID or other diseases, because believe it or not, there's other sicknesses out there than just COVID. But when different people and family members and loved ones pass away from this stuff, it's always natural for people to ask why it had to happen. There's a whole bunch of different answers for that. However, none of them ever seem satisfactory when you're actually going through that trial or that sorrow and that grief. Like if, for say, I lost my father or something, as opposed to one of my friends losing his father. If someone, like on the internet, lost his dad, I might shed a tear, but at the same time, I could throw out a million different reasons for why God allowed it to happen, and think that those should be satisfactory for the guy. But then if I experienced my father passing away, none of those reasons, I think, would satisfy me at the time, because the grief overcomes those reasons, and because of our own emotions. So the difference being is that underlying all of that, the Christian has hope that God has the answers, as opposed to the person who doesn't believe in God having to accept that that's just the way it is. And with the case of David, there's a very, very powerful verse, which, no, I won't go down that rabbit trail. All right. So at the end of that passage, when David is talking about, or in the account of David's child getting sick and dying in less than a week, it says that all of his servants were scared to tell him that the child is dead, because they said, he's beating himself up over this, he's not eating, he's not doing all of this. What is he going to do as soon as we tell him that the child's dead? He kind of overhears it, and he asks, is the child dead? They say, yes, he is. When David just gets up, goes back to normal. And they ask him, why in the world, when the child was sick and whatnot, that you fasted and you prayed and you cried and you didn't eat, you didn't drink anything, you didn't wash yourself for all this time, and now that you find out the child's dead, you just go back to normal as if nothing happened? And David's answer is very profound and kind of points to the underlying hope that the Christian can have. David says, I fasted and prayed and did all this other stuff because I didn't know whether or not God would be merciful to me and give me a second chance. However, he says, obviously God did not give me that second chance. But he says that the child is dead, God has taken the child to be with him. He says at the end of the verse, he will not come to me, but I will go to him. That's the underlying hope that the Christian can have. That when people pass away and loved one, this is dealing with grief in general, but this is more specifically dealing with the passing of someone, that when hard times come and people pass away, the people without Christ can't take any comfort in it, other than just thinking to themselves, that's just the way it is. It happens to all of us eventually. The Christian has the underlying hope that eventually you'll meet with those people that have passed on, which makes the difference between Christian sorrow and worldly sorrow is that the Christian has hope in the midst of their sorrow. So, going on to the second point. Let's see. I believe I have about 5 minutes left. So let's see if I can wrap this up. Going on to the second point. Second point in the exposition was Mordecai's faith, talking about how Mordecai had faith that God would deliver them. Today's takeaway for point number 2 for that is trusting God's providence. Because God can provide, believe it or not. And a great verse, or verses to go with that, is Acts chapter 27. How many have read through the book of Acts? All right. Acts chapter 27 is kind of an interesting story that doesn't exactly get that much attention because it's, well, not one of the Old Testament ones. However, Paul is on his way to Rome to appear before Caesar, I believe, and several other people as well to hear his charges that were brought against him. However, on his way there, he gets on a ship, and there's a crazy storm outside. He tells the centurion that he's with, we shouldn't go out. The centurion decides that he's going to pay attention to the captain of the ship rather than Paul, and they go out. While they're in the middle of that, I believe that Luke might have actually been on the ship with him because Luke wrote the book of Acts, and at that point he transitions and says all this stuff happened to us and uses the pronoun as if he's part of the group as well. So Luke could have been on the ship as well. And so he writes in there that all of them have given up hope because of how terrible the storm was, and I think they even started throwing stuff overboard and whatnot, trying to lighten the load, and nothing was working and whatnot. And then it says that Paul told the centurion and the captain and everyone else there, don't be afraid because an angel appeared to me last night and told me that all of us are going to stay alive. The ship is going to be destroyed, but all of us are going to live. And he says something along the lines of, take heart and be of good cheer because I have faith in my God. Leave it to Paul. The guy that at the beginning of the book of Acts was overseeing the murder of Christians. And then after the incident on the road to Damascus, he turned his life around, gave his life to Christ, and now at the end of the book of Acts, he's literally telling all these guys in the middle of this massive storm, God said we're going to be safe. I believe it. And after that, and throughout the rest of because they're on the ship a while after that, and the storm is still going strong in the midst of that. However, over the course of the rest of the chapter, you can see that all of the other guys on the ship start getting excited and start getting their spirits lifted because of Paul's faith that he has in the fact that God will provide and that God will deliver them out of that. The same with the situation with Mordecai. He says that if Esther doesn't go in before the king, all of them could die, but all the Jews are not going to die because God said that they wouldn't, because God has to take them back to Israel. And so, going on to the last point. Point number 3 in the exposition was Esther's decision to go before the king against the law. Point number 3 in the topical segment is godly courage. So here's a good trick question. Can you have courage without fear? I say no. Because I believe that the definition of courage is actually doing something in spite of the fear. Which, using that definition, it is not a sin to be afraid of something. Some people, I believe, mistakenly have read into the verses where the angels say, fear not, taking that as a direct commandment and proof text for the fact that if you're afraid, that means you're sinning. I personally do not believe that's the case. I believe it was Dr. David Jeremiah who used a great illustration. Was not necessarily using the same point that I'm trying to make. However, it fits just the same. Of a little kid being afraid of the dark, and he goes to sleep, or tries going to sleep, and he's laying awake in bed, and it's so dark, and he's getting so scared. In the same way with the angels, in the instances when the angels pop up in the Bible, and all the people being sore afraid, as it says, because it's a creature or a person that stands in the presence of God himself, which means that they are without sin, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And when people are exposed to perfection, that's when they start recalling all of their own sin, because it gives them something to contrast it with. And in the case of this, that when people are afraid of something, as is the case with the people in the Bible when they meet an angel, the way that the angel says, don't be afraid, I don't believe it's an order, but rather a statement of comfort. In the same way that when a little kid is scared of the dark or something like that, his dad, as David Jeremiah, I believe it was, maybe it was Chuck Swindoll put it, does not kick open the door of his room and scream, "Come on, David, I need you to be courageous." That is not the way courage works. You don't have it ordered upon you. In the same way, you don't have fear taken away from you because someone orders you to stop. In this case, the same with the stories with the angels and whatnot. I do not believe that being afraid of something is a sin. I mean, can you really go to a little kid who's afraid of the dark? Or your mom, who might be afraid of cockroaches or spiders or something like that, and deem the fact that she shrivels up into a corner when she sees a bug as her sinning against God? I think that's going way too far with these different instances. And in the case of that, if courage is something totally separate from fear, or if fear is joined with courage, and the fact that you can't be courageous if you don't have fear, that means that if fear is a sin, that Jesus was not brave, if you're using that definition. Which personally, I believe that fear, too much fear and what you do in the out of that fear can be a sin. As is a great example, the deer in the headlights. If the deer doesn't get out of the way, the deer is going to die. So in that case, the fear is not wrong. Standing still is. In this case, with Jesus, I believe that Jesus was scared before he went to the cross. When he went to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he went aside separate times so that he could pray. And he kept asking God the Father, if it's possible for another way, please let it happen. And it says that he was, I believe, sorely grieved, it said, and that his sweat became as drops of blood. I don't think that anyone can look at that passage and say Jesus was not scared. Because that's what happens when people get scared. And that's also why God the Father sent an angel down to strengthen him. It is because Jesus was scared, which is why he asked God if he could take the burden off of him, if there was another way to do it. However, what Jesus did out of that was Jesus went through with it, Jesus went to the cross, which means that Jesus didn't give in to his fear in the same way he didn't give in to his temptation when Satan was tempting him. So in the same way, I believe that temptation is not necessarily a sin, but that giving in to temptation is a sin. I think that it's safe to say that being afraid of something is not necessarily a sin. However, doing something sinful in the spite of that is a sin. So you have to be careful with that. In this case, with Queen Esther, she was doubtlessly afraid to go in front of the king. As is said by her reply to him saying, don't you know the law that's set in place that if the king doesn't want me there, I'm dead? I'm pretty sure that she was scared. On top of that, she asked for 3 days for everyone to pray and fast for her. That might have been, at first, that she wasn't fully convinced that this is what she needed to do. She might have been giving herself 3 days to change her mind. However, over the course of those 3 days, because of the fasting and the prayer, I believe, God strengthened her so that she could go through that. Does not mean she was not afraid. It just means that she did what she knew she was supposed to do, despite the fact that she was afraid. So, that is going to wrap things up. That was Esther chapter 4. And let's see, next Wednesday, Lord willing, we are going to be going over Esther chapter 5, where we're going to find out whether or not the king accepted Esther, which, of course, everybody knows that he did, of course, otherwise there wouldn't be the rest of the book. So, and all the other stories that a lot of people undoubtedly know. And, of course, more feasts. Because the book of Esther is full of feasts. Everybody loves food, especially the king. So, Esther uses that to her advantage. And now we're going to have a quick word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for this time that we've had together. May you be glorified in everything that is said and done and thought among us. We ask that you help us to remember these lessons that you've brought before us through your word. We ask that you help us to remember to study your word, Father, to learn more not only about you, Father, but about how you would have us to live this life. Help us to have the faith of Mordecai and the courage of Esther, Father, and that you would give us the strength to act according to your word rather than our emotions, and that you would receive all the glory. And we ask all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.